In 2016, Britain voted to leave the EU, and there was euphoria amongst Vote Leave, who hoped it would lead to a national resurgence, lower immigration, and perhaps other countries in the EU would want to follow suit. Yet, 5 years after officially leaving the EU, regret for the decision has never been higher. The economy is stagnating, immigration soared, and voters are struggling to see any obvious benefit to the biggest constitutional change for decades. Yet despite the unpopularity of Brexit, there's a lack of enthusiasm to reconsider the decision. 9 years of tortuous debate has left the country exhausted, and Brexit's become a bit like that embarrassing uncle we'd just rather forget about. Before the vote, George Osborne warned a vote to leave would cause a recession and higher taxes. That never materialised. Apart from a 13% devaluation of the pound, fears of a recession were overblown. It seemed that Project Fear was just that. Yet more sober forecasts suggested that leaving the single market and customs union would lead to long-term costs, lower investment, lower growth, lower trade. And as the UK edged towards a harder Brexit, forecasts of this slow puncture on the economy kind of came true with lower investment, lower trade and lower growth. One of the biggest costs of Brexit has been the negative impact on investment. You can see in 2016 it was a big turning point, with UK investment growing much more slowly than other countries. Firms put investment decisions on hold because of all the uncertainty about Brexit and the new trading relations. The loss of investment from the European Investment Bank has not been adequately replaced. As it turned out, leaving the EU was more complicated and difficult than many ever expected. The referendum was a simple yes or no, but leaving gave a complex matrix of seemingly impossible trade-offs, none of which anyone particularly liked. The EU was definitely in no mood to give the best of both worlds and reward leaving. One nadir was December 2018, when the Theresa May government lost a series of meaningful votes. Every different form of Brexit, from a single market to customs union, was voted down by Parliament. It was much easier to say what you didn't like than accept what was on offer. It seemed that after all, you couldn't have your cake and eat it. In the EU, the UK had actually been a major player. It was a primary mover in shaping legislation and the direction of the EU, notably Mrs Thatcher's promotion of the single market. The UK was also one of the biggest objectors to EU policy, and for its awkwardness often got special concessions. It gained a rebate on CAP, it gained an exemption from joining the euro, it wasn't a member of Schengen, and it had partial opt-outs from things like the Charter of Fundamental Rights and for a time the Social Charter. One of the unfortunate things about leaving is that all these special opt-outs and special deals are probably not there if we ever wanted to rejoin. Now, within the EU, those who envisaged a federal Europe probably were happy to see the UK, the awkward member, leave, but this has probably been outweighed by Europeans who regret the UK's departure. COVID, the Ukraine war, Trump, the rise of China, all stress the benefits of having the UK with good relations with the rest of Europe. The OBR claimed that as a result of Brexit, the UK economy is 4% smaller than it otherwise would have been. This is similar to other studies such as by NIESR, which claim that by 2035, the average citizen will be around £2,300 worse off than if the UK had stayed in the EU. Now, 4% loss of GDP may not sound that much, but given the disastrous economic performance of the UK in the past 15 years, its income tax and wages, the UK can ill afford to lose. Certainly, economic growth has slowed down a lot in recent years. Since 2019, UK real GDP per capita has actually been negative. Of course, there are many factors behind the dismal UK economic performance. Austerity, COVID, gas prices, political instability, poor decision-making, poor productivity growth. And in fact, it's not just the UK having a poor economy. Western Europe and Germany in particular is experiencing its own form of economic slowdown, economic crisis. But whilst it's difficult to untangle all the causes for the UK's poor economic growth and the extent to which Brexit is the cause of, the implementation of new EU-UK trade deal has led to very specific and observable costs for business. Exports by smaller business has fallen by 30%, with greater trade frictions leading to a 13% fall in goods exports to Europe. Services have done much better, hardly been affected at all. Furthermore, though, the pain for business is not over. New custom checks are still coming in, for example for food before being imported or exported. It leads to higher food prices, more friction in the border, and makes it difficult for firms to export abroad. I export a few books to Europe and have been dismayed by the nearly 100-200% rise in delivery costs because of the new custom fees. Even sending a book worth €10 to Ireland now attracts custom fees. You have to pick it up at the post office. Rant over. Anyway, given the UK's perilous economic situation and their seeming desperation to have higher economic growth, it's perhaps surprising the new Labour government is so quick to rule out even something like rejoining the customs union. It's not like people were flocking to the polls in 2016 so we could strike a free trade deal with Australia. Whilst the government desperately looked for growth, the OBR suggests that closer ties to Europe are one thing that would really move the dial. What many voters did want from leaving the EU was control over borders and a reduction in immigration. But in a paradoxical way, the post-Brexit new immigration policy chosen by the then Conservative government led to a surge in net migration, with much higher levels than ever before. Enabling more work and student visas from outside the EU led to more family members coming along as well. And with a higher age profile, the net fiscal benefit of this new type of migration is lower than what we had in the EU. Not only did legal migration soar post-Brexit, but also it coincided with a surge in unauthorised small boat crossings. An academic paper found that one reason behind the growth in channel crossings was a failure to reach a returns agreement after leaving the EU. Now, one of the proposed benefits of a hard Brexit was that outside the customs union, the UK would be free to adopt new free trade deals. And in particular, a free trade deal with the US was seen as a major prize that could help the UK economy navigate a post-EU world. However, 5 years after Brexit, a free trade deal with the US looks less likely than ever. Firstly, the US would want lower agricultural and environmental standards. Chlorinated chicken, hormone-treated beef and genetically modified food is not particularly appetising to the UK consumer. Biden quietly dropped it, but the bigger picture is that the US just isn't interested in a free trade deal. Trump has said that tariff is the most beautiful word in the dictionary. Trump has considerable unpredictability, but the chance of a global trade war is higher than ever before. It's hard to see a free trade deal coming about if the UK ever had a special relationship with the United States. It's hard to see that blossoming with Trump and Starmer. Given the changing priorities of the US, the rise of China's export dominance, it seems a natural development to maintain good ties with Europe. The big question is what now? Whilst regret is high, support for rejoining is much more narrow, a reflection that it's much harder to rejoin. Interestingly, the EU was never actually that salient as an issue. It was only just before the referendum, with all the media coverage, it became temporarily the number one issue. Perhaps the most articulate leader for rejoining is currently the 92-year-old Michael Heseltine. There's certainly no young, charismatic leader to lead the charge in a way that perhaps Nigel Farage galvanised Euroscepticism. The truth is that although Brexit was an economic cost, rejoining the EU would be no magic bullet for an economy that's struggling on many fronts. Rejoining the EU might help a little bit, but it won't on its own lead to a land of milk and honey. Rejoining the customs union does make sense from an economic perspective. It would help to remove those non-tariff barriers without having to accept free movement of labour. What about just rejoining the single market? On the one hand, EU sceptics may point to problems with things like the German and French economy. It's hardly a ringing endorsement at the moment. But on the other hand, the success of Eastern European economies like Poland and the Czech Republic show how EU membership can still have substantial benefits. The EU still accounts for 50% of UK trade. And there was a time when free movement of labour meant there was a surge in workers from Eastern Europe coming to the UK to get perhaps at least double their average salary. But these days of huge inequalities are coming to an end. Polish wages are growing faster than the UK. By one prediction, Polish wages will overtake the UK by 2035. And it's not just Poland. Slovenia and countries like that are already quite similar to UK living standards. The important thing is that the big inequality which caused those very large migration of workers from east to west may be much less noticeable in the future. Who knows, perhaps in the future we want free movement of labour to move elsewhere in the continent and get higher wages. Another issue around the Brexit vote is that the majority of people who voted to leave tended to be older generations. Younger people are generally more supportive, but now many younger people will feel they never got to vote and the decision was affecting them a lot. And with 9 years since the vote was held, many of the older vote leavers are no longer with us. So it's a good argument to say that big constitutional changes should only happen once a generation, but the future generation may have a very different outlook than 9 years ago. In fact, another lesson perhaps of Brexit is that referendums themselves can be very divisive and inadequate as a means of dealing with very difficult questions. Referendum and dealing with the result can be a big distraction. The UK definitely spent a lot of time and energy in trying to implement Brexit and work out what form it would take. All that time and energy and money could have been spent on other areas such as trying to boost UK productivity, address inequality, or solve the housing crisis. Arguably these were the real problems facing the UK. You could argue it's a shame the UK didn't have a referendum on something like, should we tax wealth more and fix the housing crisis? Many voted leave as a vote against the establishment, but there are no signs that anything fundamentally changed. Perhaps a missed opportunity. Even some Brexiteers are not particularly happy. Many felt that Brexit was never really implemented, which is strange on one hand because we did leave the customs union, did leave the single market. But if you voted Brexit to reduce immigration and then immigration soars, you can understand the frustration there. So if you're disappointed with Brexit Britain, is it time to leave and go elsewhere? There are some reasons, but forget, the grass is not always greener on the other side. And in the post-Brexit world, it may be a little harder to get a work visa anyway.